You may well wonder why in the world I'm standing here in front of a cottage in the cottage country of central Ontario, 50 miles or so northeast of Toronto. It's the home of Lewis Parker, whose forebears came from the Sydney area of Cape Breton, so there is that connection, at least with our East Coast heritage. Lew Parker is a painter, and he produces magnificently detailed instants of history, recreations of times out of our past, the kind of thing that you'll be able to see this year at places like Fort Beausejour. It's a fascinating occupation, and it's undertaken in a fascinating way. I think you'll enjoy this meeting with Lewis Parker.
Lou, when I first started to look into this story for heritage, there was one word that popped into my mind, which certainly doesn't express it all, but I think gives us a good place to start. The word was collaboration, which seems somehow foreign to the artistic temperament, but perhaps we can find out how it works. And that's why I'm glad that we have Terry Shaw here, who is an interpretation specialist with Parks Canada, because the two of you have worked so closely together on this series of paintings, but also, I think, Terry, long before this series ever came up.
That's correct, and before I was with Parks Canada. Goes back, I guess, to 1972, when I was involved in the restoration, renovation of the National Museum building in downtown Ottawa. And this was the National Museum of Man and the National Museum of Natural Sciences. And in that one particular hall, the Archaeology Hall, we, of course, showed a lot of artifacts that archaeologists dig up in their excavations. But to try and show the visitor what kind of story lay behind the artifacts, the activity that was carried on that related to those artifacts.
These chunks and odds and bits
right.
wouldn't necessarily mean anything to people.
That's right, bones and arrowheads and that sort of thing. To try and bring the activity that left those in the ground, to bring that alive, we decided to do some short films to recreate events. And to do these films, we went to Lew Parker and his partner, Jerry Lazar, to create artwork that we could then turn into these short films.
And had you done this kind of work before?
Yes, I had been involved with studies on Indians themselves, mostly woodland. And this was quite a challenge after doing the woodland Indians and the Plains Indians and the Mexican Indians to do the Indians of the North.
Mm.
Yes.
This work then was really done for films.
That's
although
correct.
These illustrations that we see here, of course, are in the book, but
Yes,
these were actually used in the films.
The original purpose of the paintings was for these films, for the National Museum. That's correct.
Now, how did you stumble on Mr. Parker?
Well, we heard about the Indian paintings that were used at St. Marie among the Hurons, and couldn't find anybody better qualified to do this kind of work with that kind of background.
So how long did you work with him at that time, Terry?
Oh, I guess it must have taken about probably better than a year. I'd say a year and a half, including the pre-production time.
And the archaeologists were involved in this too, were they, in the research for the backgrounds for these?
That's right. I was essentially a middleman in that process, an organizer, to bring the necessary people together to provide the research, ensure that the painting was historically accurate, to advise on the interpretation, and to help create the complete sequence of events that would have gone into in this case, the whale hunt.
Is there any measure of absolutism in accuracy? The archaeologists, can they offer definite facts, or is it opinion which governs what goes in?
Oh, it's a decided mixture of the two. There are a lot of facts, but there's a lot of areas that are speculative, and And it's a lot of areas that it's very hard to pin these experts down on, and this is quite a game, in fact, between Lou and myself, because we have to have an answer. We can't avoid answering questions when we show them in a painting. So it's great fun to try and pin some of the experts down on these points.
Lou, had you ever done any work for film before?
Not in the sense that the camera roamed around the painting, no. But the paintings of Indians done for Fort St. Marie at Midland were slides. They were still pictures taken of various areas of the paintings. So it was very similar.
And yet it must have seemed like another new challenge for you at the time.
Oh, indeed. And to have someone like Terry in the middle, as he said, organizing all these other people, rather than having to chase down, as Jerry Lazar and I did for the Woodland Indians, having to read through the Jesuit relations and Champlain and Sagar, just took us away from the drawing board. Terry, in effect, prepares everything, all the material, and says, okay, this is what has to go into the illustration. And I consider them to be illustrations of historic life rather than paintings. A painting is where you're involved with color, form, light, but these are very subjective. You're involved with depicting people who existed 300, 400, 500 years ago.
And with as much accuracy as you can employ.
And this is the whole point. The accuracy is much more essential in the painting.
The paintings that we have here, this is the method of beluga whaling. Are these all of the frames that were done for the film?
That's right, yeah.
Just the 5?
And just to arrive at that number, well, there's budgetary considerations. We had a budget to work to, but we had to decide how many pictures were needed to show the whole process, from sighting whales to breaking the whales down into the food and the industrial fodder that the Eskimos made of it.
It seems amazing to me that you can get a 10 or 12-minute film out of 5 small frames, but they're not so small, and I guess the camera can get in quite close and work on them.
Oh, the originals to these were what, Terry, about 30 by 20 or something
Yeah,
like that?
I would say, yeah, at least that.
Yeah.
At least that
And so the
size.
camera could zoom in on one little section, say pick out a character that had been concentrated on, and then follow out to the background in which the whales in the next painting are indicated.
Mm-hmm.
Then
So
the
that
camera,
you could travel naturally from one
Right.
frame. And that also is a consideration that I guess you had to keep in mind.
Yes, the time element in trying to get a painting to show one instant in time, but to suggest what's gone before and what's going to come after. This is something that has to be figured out very accurately, too.
I'm glad you said it in quite that way, because it gives us a perfect introduction to the series of paintings that we want to discuss right now. And that is the series that you have produced for Fort Beausejour. Yeah, I think you've explained the collaboration, that word that I used at the beginning, very well. And now let's see how it works. You have 7 paintings
That's correct. Yeah.
to illustrate the life, instants in time, in history, at Fort Beausejour. How does that begin?
Well, at Fort Beausejour, we have a very special case of a historic site. Perhaps I shouldn't say special case, because there are a lot of sites that are like this, in that they're not suitable for rebuilding structures or for putting people on site in costume. Various reasons for this. At Fort Beausejour, of course, the ruins that are there represent quite a wide span of time. Some of them are from the French period, some of them are from the British period of the fort. And it would be a very difficult decision to make what period you would build structures if you wanted to restore the fort.
Or there may have been different structures on the same site at different
That's right,
periods. Yeah.
exactly. Now, in the case of Lewisburg is, I think, a useful parallel, where they have restored the site to a particular point in time, and they do put animators, people in costume, on that site to attempt to bring the site alive, to recreate a moment in time. But that's a very expensive route to take, and as I say, not all sites are suited to that. At Fort Beausejour, we've adopted the use of paintings, in effect, to do much the same thing, to try and create a reconstruction of an event of the site itself in terms of structures, show the people that would have been there at that particular time in costume, and often a particular event of significance in the history of the fort. So we kind of bring it all together in a painting. And I think this is, from an interpreter's point of view, a very effective technique in trying to stimulate the imagination of the visitor to the site, try and get them to think and imagine what it was like to be on that site back in a point in history.
I have a mental impression of an army of people all concentrating their energies on the development of, say, one idea for one of these paintings. Is that reasonably correct?
That's not far off the mark.
It's sort of funneled, though, rather than everybody doing it at one time. It's all funneled through Terry. So.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially,
you're the neck in the bottle, are you?
That's right. Essentially, the concept originates with the interpreter. He decides on that we're going to use this particular medium to achieve our interpretive goals, and then determines the concept behind the painting, the selection of the particular point in time of the event to be shown, that sort of thing. Those decisions are made by the interpreter.
Well, why don't we get to one of the paintings, and you can go through the whole process for us, the two of you, and we'll find out just where it started, how it developed, what stages you went through, and what the finished result is.
Okay, well, let's take this painting, which shows Fort Beausejour in 1754, which is in the French period, 1 year before the fort was taken over by the British forces. And this is an interesting one because it I think illustrates the kinds of things that I was mentioning, in that it involves the reconstruction of structures. It involves a considerable amount of animation by people in the period dress of the time. And it also illustrates certain historic themes that are important in the history of Fort Beausejour.
Well, how many of those buildings are present on the site now?
Oh, none. However, all that's left on the site now essentially are some old foundations that have been stabilized. There are no buildings as such.
You have a photograph there.
That's
You were
right.
just reaching for it, Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this shows the same view that a visitor to the site would see. If they were standing in the spot represented by the painting today, they would see this. And as you can see, that it's very different. There are no structures there. There are some stone foundations. These existing structures were not necessarily there. These stone structures were not necessarily there at the time that we're showing in 1754. For example, the stone wall, the curtain wall in the background, that was not there in the French period. That was a later addition to the fort. And actually, the stone foundations that you see in the foreground also are from the British period.
So I can see quite clearly why you need the painting to depict
That's right, exactly.
what was there then.
That's right. And when we go about recreating this, we have to, as I say, once the concept is determined and the point of view and the intention of the painting, that's when we bring in all these, literally an army of people, to provide all the precise information, the research, so that we can create as accurate a representation as possible of what it was like in 1754.
Lou, when Terry comes up with one of these ideas, what's the first information that you get?
Well, let me see. Generally, the first thing I had to concentrate on was the shape of the fort, which remained fairly constant from 1754 until the last one shot, 1779.
Mm-hmm.
So that allowed me to select perspective points, to viewpoints, based on the plans that we had developed. Is there one with the plans there? Yeah, down at the bottom there.
This is a plan of the fort in 1752, done by, I guess, a French engineer at the time. And so we can use this as our starting point, essentially. It shows the buildings that were on the site at the time. As Lou mentioned, the shape of the fort, the earthworks, are essentially the same as they were then. So we are able then, once we've selected our point of view for the painting, we're able then to determine just what buildings would be in the painting. And then we have to look back and find out what those buildings would have looked like. We know where they were situated, but what did they in fact look like?
Did you have floor plans or architects' renderings or something to work to?
You know, in this case, we did have one reference, historic reference of one of the buildings, and that's one of the reasons we chose this angle, because we did have a pretty good idea of what one of the major buildings looked like. That's the main building in the background. The other two buildings, no, we have no specific reference for them. All we have is this original plan that says, for example, that the building on the right is a storehouse. That's all we know. We know that the building in the back was a barracks. And again, that's basically all we know.
So then your researchers would have to decide what a storehouse of that period would have looked like.
That's correct. And where we're at a tremendous advantage in this, of course, is thanks to all the research that's been done at Lewisburg, where they have rebuilt approximately 1/5 of that 18th century city. And to do that, they have spent many, many years in very intensive research into historical structures of that period, methods of building, and all this has been very helpful in giving us some kind of a clue as to what the structure in Fort Beausejour might have been like.
Well, this is very close to the same period, isn't it?
That's correct.
Mhm.
That's correct. For example, in this particular storehouse, we went around and talked to our research people, and there was no clear-cut answer, but the consensus was that the building would be a Piquet-style building. Actually, this changed throughout the evolution of this painting. It started out as a plank building, and then we later changed it to this Piquet style, which is the upright logs with plaster in between, because it was felt that this more primitive style of building is probably all that would have been done at this time when building just a simple storehouse.
So somewhere along the line you have to make, well, not compromises exactly, but decisions as to what would have been done. They might not necessarily be correct, but they'll be close.
That's right, and this is, as I say, where we try and pin our experts to the wall, whether they like it or not.
But
And
as a matter of-
experts don't like being
They
pinned, do
often
they?
don't.
In determining, for instance, that building on the right that we're referring to there,
What happened to it? Oh, yeah, they're determining this building, even the sketches, the preliminary sketches.
went historically through all kinds of styles of architecture in which the experts or the authority or researchers would have to say, that's out, that's out.
And for each one of these, you did one of these linear drawings, is that right?
Well, not the whole thing. Boy, that would take, to redraw the whole thing over and over again. No, we'd do sections of it. And, well, as a matter of fact, I would do the sketch and send Terry maybe 5, 6 different Xeroxes, and he would send these to the authorities, who would really have to be faced with a two-dimensional presentation of what it might have looked like, so they could say, just change that a little bit, you see? We had this problem, especially on this one with the windows, with the shutters, that went back and forth from casement to what's the other style?
Well, the sash style, right.
And then the shutters, whether they were single shutters or double. And even to the final painting, we would make decisions that would just change it slightly if some authority, some new authority, or some consideration we hadn't had before came into play.
We'll take a long and detailed look at the other paintings Lewis Parker has done for Fort Beausejour right after these messages.
Each painting represents a precise moment, a detailed record of an historical event. This is Fort Cumberland, the British name, in November 1776. The garrison has been alerted to a threat of attack by a group of American revolutionaries under Jonathan Eddy. We see British soldiers moving barrels of gunpowder from storage outside to a strong casemate. Several buildings, a danger to the fort if set on fire, are being dismantled. A few months earlier, in the summer of 1776, Fort Cumberland is reoccupied by the British after being abandoned since 1768. A group of Yorkshire settlers who have taken over the rich marshland since the French left are helping the new British garrison to set the decaying fortifications to rights. These are the Royal Fencible Americans under Joseph Gorham, sent here to protect the frontier and the back door to Halifax from any revolutionary incursions from New England. They will not have very long to wait. Summer 1778. 2 years have passed, 2 years too many for much of the garrison. Gorham's Royal Fencibles have seen no action since Eddy's abortive uprising in late 76. 2 soldiers, relieved from guard duty, hurry to the inviting warmth of the barrack block fires. Soldiers of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine remove supplies from a casemate. It is 1754. Fort Beausejour is still French. In the background, Thomas Pichon, civilian administrator of the garrison and British spy, checks his stock. He will be instrumental in the fort's fall to the British, as it did shortly before this picture. Now it is spring, 1756. We see soldiers of the 40th Regiment returning home after a day on woodcutting detail. There are still many French partisans as well as hostile Indians, so outside work means an armed escort. Another year has passed. It is now 1757, and the defenses of Fort Cumberland are still being strengthened. The old French main gate has been removed and a strong casemate put in its place. The British felt the old gate invited attack from the landward side and have moved it to a more defensible position. In another year, Louisbourg will fall, and in 1759, Quebec. The 7 Years' War will be over, but that time is not yet. In the background, a Royal Artillery officer supervises the installation of a gun battery on top of the new casemate by soldiers of the 43rd, while soldiers of the 28th Regiment have their hands full with this gun, a naval piece weighing nearly a ton.
Very quickly, how long does it take from the time you get the first suggestion from Terry until you have the completed painting?
Well, it depends on how fast the reference comes to Terry, and he can get it back to me. We could render one of these things if everything went like clockwork, which is inconsiderable. It never does. But if it did, it would be, say, a week establishing the viewpoint and the pencil in here and everything, another week establishing all the details that have to go into the characters that are portrayed doing things, another week to get it all consolidated, and then a final week to color it, and then another half a week to make the corrections on the new authorities that turn up.
Okay, now that's a month, but it doesn't happen in a month.
No, in practice it takes several months, and I must say that Lou, besides being a fabulous artist, is probably the most patient man I've ever met. There are corrections coming in right up to the last minute, and Lou has been extremely patient in making these corrections as they come in, even up to making corrections on the final painting virtually as it's being delivered.
Well, there's another program following hard on our heels, and I don't think it has much patience. Thank you very much.
Lewis Parker has now been commissioned to do an 8th painting for the Fort Beausejour collection. In the meantime, he has been busy with other projects for the area. Next week, we'll discuss this painting with Lewis Parker, the building of the dikes at Grand Pré by Acadian settlers in the 17th century.
A painting like this is not a painting in itself. It's a work animal to illustrate, to describe something, to do something, to do a task, to tell people now what it was like 300 years ago. And so it's not a painting as is, it's an illustration.